The wind howled across the barren canyon, carrying the acrid scent of smoke and scorched earth. A lone figure pressed himself against jagged rocks, muscles trembling, every heartbeat a drum of survival. Dust swirled in the air like restless spirits, and in the distance, the sun carved the desert into harsh shadows. He was broken, not just in body but in spirit. A cowboy who had lost more than he could ever count, and now the world was catching up with him. His name didn't matter anymore. Names never mattered out here. Only survival did. He had thought hiding in the remote canyons would save him. He had thought that by vanishing from the towns, from the law and from the memories that haunted him, he could find peace. Peace had a funny way of avoiding the desperate. He pressed a hand to his side, feeling the ragged scar of a bullet wound, and cursed under his breath. Every movement reminded him of the last gunfight, of the friends he'd buried, of the lawmen who would have hunted him down without mercy. The desert offered solitude, yes, but it demanded vigilance in return. And yet for the first time in months he allowed himself a whisper of hope. Maybe here, among the rocks and the dust, he could finally fade away. Then a sound split the dry air, a clatter of hooves, uneven and ragged, like a heartbeat faltering on its last pulse. He squinted against the glare, trying to make sense of the figure emerging from the horizon. It was a woman riding a horse that seemed barely alive, collapsing with each step, its sides heaving. Her hair was dark and wild, eyes sharp and burning, and even from a distance, he could feel the fierce determination in her stance. She was an Apache, and every instinct he had told him that nothing about this was ordinary. Nothing good ever came riding from the desert alone. The cowboy straightened, gripping the worn handle of his revolver, though he doubted he could aim steady enough to fire. The woman was closer now, and he could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the desperation in the way she leaned over her horse, urging it forward despite the obvious pain. A sudden gust of wind blew sand into his eyes, and when he blinked it away, she was almost upon him. With a shuddering groan, the horse collapsed at his feet, throwing her to the ground. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the harsh wind and the echo of the fall. And then she lifted her head, coughing, blood speckling her lips, and stared at him. In that gaze, he saw a fire he hadn't felt in years. A fire that demanded attention, demanded action. She reached for something at her belt, and he stepped forward, instinct overriding caution. "You've got to help me," she rasped. Her voice was raw, heavy with urgency. They're coming." The cowboy hesitated. He had avoided trouble for months. He had sworn to himself he would fade into dust before getting entangled in another fight. But the look in her eyes twisted something deep inside him, a memory of honor, of debts unpaid, of lives lost because he stayed silent. Without a word, he helped her to her feet and guided her behind the cover of the rocks. Minutes stretched like hours as she gasped for breath. I need to reach the settlement before nightfall," she said. "If they catch me..." Her voice broke and she clutched his arm. "You don't understand. They'll kill everyone." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Who's coming?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "A gang. They call themselves the Black Vipers. They took everything from my people, from me, and I have something they want. Something that could change everything." He nodded once, grimly. "Then we're running out of time." By the time the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, painting the rocks in blood-orange hues, the two of them were on the move. He rode with a silent efficiency born from years of experience, the woman leaning heavily on him, her own strength fading but her determination unwavering. Shadows stretched across the desert floor, concealing them from casual sight but not from the keen eyes of the Black Vipers, who were already closing in, alerted by scouts and whispers in the wind. The first encounter came at dusk. They had crossed a narrow pass when figures emerged from the shadows, rifles glinting. The cowboy cursed under his breath and kicked his horse forward. But there was little room to maneuver. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the canyon walls, sharp and unrelenting. He felt the sting of a graze on his arm, but he ignored it, firing back with precision honed by years of blood and practice. The Apache woman ducked behind a boulder, producing a small, ornate pistol from her sash and returning fire with surprising accuracy. They were outnumbered, but the terrain worked in their favor. The cowboy guided them through a narrow, twisting gorge where the bandits' horses struggled, their movements slowed by the uneven rocks. He glanced at her, admiration flickering in his tired eyes. She was fearless, reckless even, yet every move was calculated. Together they were a storm. By nightfall, the vipers had retreated, leaving a trail of curses and smoke. The two took refuge in a shallow cave, water from a small spring trickling nearby. They were silent for a long while, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on them. He offered her water, which she drank greedily, then leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. "You saved my life," she said quietly, her voice raw but steady. "Why?" He looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a smile, faint and crooked. "Maybe I'm tired of running," he admitted. "Maybe I'm tired of letting the world decide who dies and who lives." She studied him, eyes reflecting the dim light of the cave. "Then we fight," she said simply. "There's no other way." The following days were a blur of sand, sweat, and gunfire. They moved by day sparingly, hiding among rock formations, and by night they pressed forward, ever closer to the settlement she sought. Every encounter with the vipers tested their limits. The cowboy's wounds ached, and her body was a map of bruises and blood. Yet they pressed on. Their bond, forged in desperation and necessity, grew stronger, a silent understanding that each was now the other's lifeline. One afternoon, as the sun hung high and merciless, they stumbled upon a small canyon where the vipers had set up a temporary camp. The woman froze, recognition flashing in her eyes. "That's them," she whispered. "That's where they keep the people they've captured." The cowboy nodded. "We end this today," he said, voice low and steady. Using the rocks as cover, they approached, silent shadows in the burning heat. When they were close enough, the cowboy drew a deep breath and charged, firing with deadly precision. The woman moved with him, a whirlwind of movement and fury, her pistol spitting fire into the camp. Chaos erupted as bandits scrambled, unprepared for the ferocity of two desperate souls. Horses reared, rifles cracked, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. In the middle of the chaos, the woman spotted the captives, tied and terrified. She sprinted toward them, cutting bonds with the edge of her blade. The cowboy covered her, felling any who dared approach. Every shot he fired carried the weight of years spent running, of lives lost, of justice denied. This was redemption, hard-earned and immediate. By the time the last bandit fell, the sun was setting, painting the desert in a fiery glow. The captives were safe. The black vipers were no more. And for the first time, the cowboy felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The woman, bruised and bleeding but alive, stood beside him. She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something more, trust, respect, perhaps even a hint of hope. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it." He shrugged, wiping sweat and blood from his brow. "We survived. That's enough for now." They rode together toward the distant settlement, the canyon behind them growing smaller with every step. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a life beyond hiding, a life where survival wasn't the only goal. And as they disappeared into the fading light, the wind whispered around the rocks, carrying with it the echoes of a cowboy who had once been broken, and the Apache woman who had reminded him that, even in the harshest deserts, courage and loyalty could light the way forward.